Welcome to the Mental Health Conference, hosted virtually by Dogwood Church. My name is Jay Vineyard. I'm the Ministry and Care Minister and one of the teaching pastors here at Dogwood.
Welcome, my name is Angela Johnston and I serve alongside Jay in the Ministry and Care Department at Dogwood. In 2019, Jay brought the vision of our team of hosting a conference focusing on mental health with practical tools to address the growing concerns. Pastor Jay, what influenced you to develop a conference focused on mental health?
Well, Angela, it started with when I started to see some really troubling signs related to mental health. And it seemed that the church was ill-equipped to respond and to provide care to these challenges. Mental health was and is probably one of the biggest challenges that the church has to address in today's world. Now, in the past, we as a church, we did not respond very well to mental health challenges. In fact, we were probably in some cases more harmful than helpful. I'll give you an example. Early on in my ministry career, when someone came to me and they said, hey, I'm depressed, I'm struggling, I always pointed to, well, you probably have a sin problem or you just don't have enough faith. And that was a typical response for most ministers. Now at times, we know that sometimes we step into sinful behavior and the Holy Spirit disrupts our souls with conviction that can be pretty depressing. But the people I started to talk to were individuals with a growing, really vibrant spiritual walk with God, and yet they still struggled with depression or they struggled with anxiety. And as I grew in my understanding of mental illness, I realized there are many examples in the Bible where some of the great prophets struggled with something like depression. For example, Elijah. Or when we look at David in the Psalms, he's working through some emotional moments in his life, and they're looking for the answers from the Lord. What we're learning is that some issues that have to deal with mental health are biological. Much like a person who has a lifelong physical disability, some people in life have a mental illness, not because they're sinful, not because they're bad people, but it's their burden to bear. And we wanted to provide hope. We also know that there are some mental illnesses that are driven by life moments. When we face a challenge, for example, what we're dealing with COVID, it produces difficult emotions in us. What we wanted to do is provide a conference that gave hope to people who are living with mental illness or some challenges that are going on in our emotions. And that's what we hope that we provide for you today.
Welcome, it's great to be with all of you today. My name is Sherry Castaneda and I'm an active member here with the Dogwood Church family, and I've had the pleasure of serving in multiple arenas, including our youth services, women's biblical studies, and our care ministries. Out of a personal passion of mine, I have finally returned to college and I'm currently pursuing my master's in individual and family therapy. So a little bit about the background here. In coordinating and planning this conference, our initial goal was to address the issue of mental health from a more general perspective. Then COVID hit. So by the beginning of June, we were beginning to see the significant impact that the virus was specifically having on the mental health of our culture. It was at that point we began to reel it in and realize we needed to narrow our focus on how COVID was affecting individual and family health. Of course, large group gatherings also became a concern. So while we would prefer to host the event in person, we recognize the need to offer the conference digitally. Nevertheless, we have the same lineup of great speakers, and we fully anticipate that the Lord will work wonderfully throughout our time together. Here shortly, you're going to hear from Dr. Gregory Moffett as he presents on two topics. You're going to love him. He will first discuss mental illness and how it impacts us, then later identify how COVID has had a direct impact on our mental health. In between those two sessions with Dr. Moffett, Pastor Jay Vineyard will interview Dr. Richard Marks to further explore how COVID has affected our families. But before we get started, Angela's going to briefly review the logistics of today's format and our breakout sessions together.
Following the plenary sessions, you can choose to participate in a breakout session of your choice. The breakout sessions will only be offered once. However, we will be placing breakout sessions as well as talks for the day on the Dogwood Church mental health page. As we prepare for our first plenary session, you need to know that each session is approximately 20 minutes in length. Now let me introduce Dr. Gregory Moffett. He is the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Point University, Professor of Counseling Psychology, published author, licensed counselor, newspaper columnist, columnist for the ACAs, Counseling Today, and public speaker. Dr. Moffitt served for nearly 10 years as the regular lecturer at the FBI Academy, a profiler with the Atlanta Cold Case Squad, and consultant to numerous airlines, businesses, and schools. He has appeared on ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox News, as well as America's Most Wanted and international television. He has served as Tyler Perry's personal consultant for the movie Alex Cross, consultant to producers for the new movie Head Full of Ghosts, and most recently, he can be seen on the Discovery Channel series Hostage. He holds an MA in counseling and a PhD in educational psychology from Georgia State University. He's a licensed professional counselor, certified professional counselor supervisor, and has taught the college level for over 30 years. We welcome Dr. Gregory Moffitt.
Hi, everybody. Appreciate you coming out and virtually being together for this event. I am Dr. Greg Moffitt. I am the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Point University, and I'm a licensed professional counselor and a certified professional counselor supervisor. I've been a mental health professional for almost 40 years now. I appreciate your interest in this topic. I'm going to be doing two things for you. I know you had a mental health conference about 2 years ago, and I'm going to be playing in this first section. I'm going to be playing on that a little bit and talking about what mental health is and how it affects us as a community. In the second half of what we're doing today, I'm going to talk about how COVID has affected us as families and individuals in the church, and some things to think about and how to take care of ourselves. So with that as an introduction, let's get going. If you give me about 20 minutes of your attention, I'll try not to bore you and hopefully give you some things to think about. So in this first session, what I'd like to do is talk to you about what mental health is. For some reason in the church, we've never treated mental health like we do everything else. So for example, at my church where I attend now, we used to have a lay counseling program, and one of our ministers at one time when he first came on staff, he knew what I did for a living and asked me what I thought about it. And I said, I don't have any problem with people trying to help, but I said, we don't have a lay dentistry program. We don't have lay cardiac surgery. I went to college for 13 years to do what I do. And it's not that the lay programs are not effective. It's that we approach it as if minimal training is all you need to be effective in the process, and that's just not the case. It requires a lot of expertise in order to help people, and I think of lay counseling, if your church does that, as more like what an EMT does. An EMT is trained for triage, an EMT is trained to help stabilize people to get them to professional help. Now, another reason that we've treated it differently is mental health has had kind of a bad reputation over history. So in a way, we've kind of asked for it. But think about this for a minute. The field of medicine has been around for millennia. Hippocrates was around the 1st century BC. It was a long, long time ago. So we've had a lot of time in medicine to perfect the science. Studies in what we know of psychology now has really only been around since the mid to late 1800s. In fact, in the 1800s, when Freud was getting out of medical school, almost all people who we think of as psychologists were actually physicians. They weren't psychologists. The first DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders that we use in mental health, wasn't written until the 1950s. And if you're going to believe this, it wasn't until about 20 years ago that we even talked in mental health about something called evidence-based practice. And what that means is you have to have evidence that the thing that you're doing as a mental health professional actually is effective. When I was in graduate school in the 1980s, we were trained to do whatever our teachers told us to do, and that's what we did. It's hard to believe that in just the last 20 years we've started asking the question, well, are these things we're doing actually effective? So we're a young science. It's come a long way. We're currently in the DSM-5, the 5th edition. There's been actually several because there have been a few revisions, but the DSM is the manual that we use to diagnose mental disorders. They're categorized by mood disorders, substance abuse disorders, anxiety disorders, and so forth. But what I want to do is give you a perspective on mental health that you might never have thought about. I always tell my students, especially when they're first learning to be clinicians, is that everybody out walking around could be diagnosed with something that's in the DSM. So we can't think of mental health in terms of sane or not sane, crazy or not crazy. Those are slang terms that we don't use in mental health. We talk in terms of function. Can a person do the business of life? So while I might be able to diagnose someone with a disorder, depression or anxiety or whatever it may be, the real question I'm concerned about is, can they get up, do the business of the day, reasonably eat, sleep, and find some pleasure in life? And if the answer is yes, it doesn't really matter if they have a diagnosed mental disorder. On the other hand, if you can't do those things, sometimes the diagnosis matters. So I'm looking in terms of function. Now, in terms of mental health and what issues that people have, that varies by gender, it varies by race, it varies by age. So just to give you some idea of the frequency of mental disorders out there, according to the National Institute of Health, in 2018, so this is just a couple years old, almost 20% of the US population had a diagnosed anxiety disorder. That's 1 in 5. So if 100 people are watching this video right now, that means 20 people statistically have been diagnosed with a generalized anxiety disorder. The borderline personality disorder is about the same at about 20%. Bipolar and OCD are at about 3%. About 17% of the population has been diagnosed with a depressive episode, and that's more frequent in females than it is in males. So I'm concerned as a mental health professional when I'm looking at the potential for disorders. Gender matters to me. Age matters to me. Developmental age matters to me. Race matters to me. So that I know, for example, that in 2018 there were 48,000 suicides. But I also know those suicides were not spread out equally across those demographics. If an individual is experiencing suicidal ideation or thinking, if that individual is an African American female, the probability of her completing suicide is almost zero. It's almost unheard of in that population. On the other hand, if that individual is Native American, Asian American, Caucasian male, that increases the probability immensely. Ironically, the same thing is true with eating disorders. Eating disorders occur in very, very small numbers in African American females, but in much higher numbers among Caucasian American women. So I know that whether we're talking about fears like phobias, if you're afraid of spiders, if you're afraid of snakes, we could diagnose you with a mental health disorder. But the fact is, if you're not a Navy SEAL or something and have to be around snakes all the time, that phobia doesn't interrupt your function. On the other hand, if your anxiety, if your depression, if your grief are inhibiting your ability to do the business of life, then we've got troubles. So I know in one way or another, all of us have been touched by mental health disorders, whether they've been diagnosed or not. But what I want to give you today is a perspective of what it's like for somebody who's living in a world of mental health issues, whether it's themselves or their families. If somebody had cancer, if somebody had diabetes, if somebody had to have surgery or had a heart attack, we don't have any stigma that's attached to that. So you can come to church and say, oh, my grandpa just had a heart attack, or oh, I just got diagnosed with diabetes. We don't do that with mental health. Mental health is stigmatized, so it's much harder for a person to express the challenges that they're facing if they're dealing with ongoing grief, if they're dealing with attention deficit, if they're dealing with generalized anxiety disorder. So it's sort of a dual perspective that we have on this. And another thing that's a dual system of the way we approach it is what we think causes it. Nobody in this audience would suppose that if an individual has diabetes that they should just pray more and their diabetes would go away. There are religions that believe that, but I don't think that's the case here, and it's certainly not my personal belief. But what people do sometimes, and this is very common in the church, is to suppose that if a person's depressed, all they really need to do is get their spiritual life in order and they'll be fine. Some depression, some OCD issues, attention deficit disorder, schizophrenia, dementia, these are physical issues, not necessarily spiritual ones. So with that as a caveat, let me take a little side trip and say there is a spiritual component to who we are. I teach at Point University. We're a Christian university, and sometimes my students come in and express depression or anxiety, and they're concerned about themselves. One of the questions that I'll ask them is if they're a spiritual person, if they're interested in their spiritual life, and the answer is usually yes. The next question I ask them is where they see themselves within that spiritual life. So if they perceive that they should be doing certain things spiritually, but they're not, or they're doing things that are contrary to that, it's very possible that their issue is a spiritual issue. So I'm not denying the possibility that there could be a spiritual component to depression and anxiety and other issues. I'm simply saying it's not the only cause. And frankly, to tell someone who is depressed that all they have to do is pray more only makes them feel more depressed. Just like you wouldn't tell somebody that's having heart troubles, just pray more and your heart troubles will go away. So what's it like to live with mental illness? Anybody who has experienced severe mental illness in their family knows exactly what I'm talking about. Whether we're dealing with suicidal risks or eating disorders or schizophrenia or dementia or bipolar disorder, these are issues that don't go away and are very, very oppressive to families, and it leads to a sense of hopelessness that life just doesn't get better. And when you combine that with the fact that it's stigmatized and we can't go to church and talk about how frustrated we are with our bipolar parent or our bipolar child, it means that we're trying to deal with it on our own or just with the help of our counselor, and that's very frustrating. One of my close friends' spouse was diagnosed a year and a half ago with pancreatic cancer, and almost immediately his family put up a page on a website, and there are a bunch of these different kinds of websites for people who are going through cancer treatment. So concerned family members and friends can check in and see the progress, see how things are going. So they can post their feelings, they can post progress in treatments and a variety of things that are related to her cancer. What I can't imagine is a world where the same thing could be said of people living with families of dementia or families who have a bipolar individual in their midst. We are changing the way that we see mental health. When I first started in the field back in 1985, the church was pretty much hands-off when it came to mental health. But there are a lot of other things that we've changed our perspective on in terms of stigmatization. If you're a person my age or older, you may remember a time when being divorced was unheard of in the church. It's not that people didn't divorce, it's that you didn't talk about it if it happened. It was almost like a scarlet letter. In fact, prior to 1972 in the United States, if you wanted to divorce, you had to have a good reason for it, and you had to go to court and prove it in court. It made divorce very expensive, very time-consuming, and therefore much less common. After 1972, we had what's called no-fault divorce that came about. And because it was cheaper and easier, more people got divorced. And now almost every church has divorce recovery, divorce support. A person can freely come in and say, yeah, I've had a painful divorce. And we are empathetic with that rather than condemning. So it's that kind of transition I would like to see in mental health. I would like to see us get to the point where we can look at mental health issues as a normal part of our dysfunction of life. Life isn't perfect. And if we can recognize that all of us are susceptible to a variety of things, either individually or within our families, it gives us an opportunity to be empathetic and to treat rather than to stigmatize. So here's what I would like to see us do in the church, 3 things. I think we need to work toward destigmatization. because people are experiencing mental health issues, it doesn't mean they're weak. It doesn't mean that they're sick. It simply means they're having troubles, and those troubles, like any other troubles, need to be addressed. And the church should be one of the first places so that we could go and say, I need help, regardless of what that help is. Secondly, I think what the church can do is provide resources. And it's not just financial, but financial is a part of it. Counseling can be very expensive. If you're dealing with issues as marriage and family issues, developmental issues, and certainly if you're dealing with ongoing major issues like schizophrenia or delusional disorders, that's very, very expensive. Back in the old days, it used to be insurance companies would pay for treatment almost indefinitely. And now with mental health managed care, often we're limited in how much we can be reimbursed for. It may be 3 sessions or 5 sessions or 10 sessions. That's still not very long. It takes me at least 2 or 3 sessions to just get a good assessment of what's going on with a child or a couple. So one of the resources that churches can provide is financial help for individuals who are going through this process. A second resource that you can provide is a referral list. If you were to go to my website, you would see a tab that says referrals, and everybody on that list is somebody that I know personally, and there's an indication of what their specialty is. It's a fairly short list given all of the counselors that I know, but I've collected those people, and they're people that I trust that I can then provide as a resource to others out there. So whether people are looking for marriage and family counselors, whether they're looking for a clinician that works with children, which is my specialty, teenagers, addictions and substance abuse, that kind of referral list should be readily available to your membership. Another resource is not that you shouldn't have lay counselors, as I talked about before, but that you should know the limitations of those lay counselors. And I would encourage, if you do have such a program, that you have a licensed professional that oversees that program to protect both clients and to protect the agency in case of a lawsuit, which is not unheard of. Third thing I think we need to consider as a body of Christ, as a group of people who's concerned about our membership, is follow-up support. Some years ago, I was working with battered women. And when I first started working with that group, somebody told me, be ready for a very, very long journey. And that's exactly what it is. When women who are in battering relationships leaving is the beginning of that journey, not the end. They often need financial help, they need emotional help, they may need parenting help, educational help. It is a very, very long journey. And it's not something that ends like with a heart surgery, let's say. You have surgery and then you begin recovering, and in a few months you're back to normal. This is something that goes on over a long period of time. Any of you who have elderly members of your family who are dealing with dementia, dementia is not something that goes away, and it's degenerative. It gets worse over time. So support systems and follow-up for people who are going through these processes is critical, and what better place to get it than in the family of God. So that's what I would like you to think about as you go into your breakout groups today. What I'll be doing next is talking about COVID. I appreciate your attention. I wish we could have been face-to-face, but I think most of us are getting used to this digital format, so thank you for your attention.
Okay, what an incredible way to kick off the day. I look forward to hearing more from Dr. Moffett in about 20 minutes, but first I would like to turn our attention to someone whom it gives me great pleasure to introduce, Dr. Richard Marks. About a year ago, a close friend of mine went through a marriage intensive with Dr. Marks, and she recommended that I reach out to him during a time that I was experiencing some hardship within my own family. I was a little hesitant, and we had met with others for support in the past. Unfortunately, as Pastor Jay had mentioned earlier, they proved to be somewhat ill-equipped and unintentionally created more harm than healing. We are so thankful for the compassion, truth, professional experience, and wisdom that Dr. Marks demonstrated in helping and equipping us with the proper tools that we needed to work through those struggles. For my husband and I, Dr. Marks was both biblically discerning and clinically competent. Dr. Marks is an ordained minister and he has a PhD in counseling psychology. He has 2 masters, a master's in marriage and family therapy and religious education. He serves as a licensed professional counselor and he often travels doing retreats, conferences, and marriage intensives throughout the country. His training includes extensive work with trauma victims, substance abuse, sexual addictions, troubled marriages, and general mental health issues. With many titles behind his name, he is most grateful to be a husband of 37 years to his wife Luella and a father to his 3 adult children. Pastor Jay Vineyard interviewed Dr. Marks, focusing on the impact that COVID has had on family dynamics. This interview will be followed by our second session with Dr. Moffett, so get ready and enjoy.
Well, welcome back into our mental health conference where we're focusing on the impact of COVID. I'm about to interview Dr. Richard Marks, who has become a great friend of Dogwood Church, a friend of me personally, and a person that I have deep appreciation for his work. He's helped a number of Dogwood families with his marriage intensives and has also done some interviews with us that we posted online about the impact of COVID and also family dynamics. So Richard, welcome back. Thanks for being with us. And you are also hosting for us a breakout session later on today where you're focusing on the impact of COVID and addictions. And so for those that we would highly encourage you to plug in on his live seminar, which will be later on today. Richard, let me start with just a general question about mental health and the impact of COVID. I came across an article, actually a friend of mine sent me an article that gave some very disturbing statistics. For example, there has been a 425% increase in the number of Georgians that took an anxiety, depression, or addiction screening. The Atlanta Police Department has responded to 1,792 suicide calls from January to September, which was almost as many as all of 2019. The article goes on to say that 45% of Americans say COVID has negatively impacted their mental health, and currently 2 million Georgians live with depression, addiction, or other mental illnesses. And maybe even one stat that's even more startling is that Georgia has experienced an increase in alcohol sales tax that has gone from $16 million to $20 million. So Richard, what is this saying to you? That's a big difference.
For the state coffers, right?
Yeah, we're lacking in some areas, but we're making up in the alcohol sales. So as you hear about these stats, as a healthcare professional, what do these numbers suggest?
What it really suggests is that the pandemic itself and the lockdown has actually restructured family dynamics. Let's be honest. In the early days, it was feared that marriages would actually break up. However, as we've gone further down the road, what we're actually now finding in the early days, marriages were much more tense, and there was a lot of requests and searches for divorce papers online, like legalzoom.com. But what we're actually finding now is, as all that's settled down, actually couples are actually starting to reconnect. They're actually starting to sit down and talk to each other. Those kind of things. So there is a little bit of hope, but overall, what we're actually seeing is people are more lonely, more disconnected than they've ever been. That was already an epidemic problem already in the United States. Is loneliness is a leading health crisis, and the pandemic has just kind of increased that overall for families and individuals.
Well, early on, you and I talked about the impact of COVID. Now, I think we started talking in April, May, and we were just on the front end of the impact of COVID. What has changed? We're almost a year into the impact of COVID. What's different today on the impact of COVID on families than it was maybe in April, May?
I think the difference is for some, because I think there's two primary reactions or responses. Some are still living in fear. They're hearing high numbers, so they're afraid to go out. If they do go out, even if they're out, they wear a mask everywhere. And you got another group that says, look, I'm not going to live in fear. I'm going to live with, my due diligence, if you will. And I'll wear the mask when I'm in a store, but I'm not going to live in fear. And I'm not going to let something that I can't control dictate my own emotional health, where some still live in fear. I think the ones that still live in fear and have a lot of worry and anxiety they're the ones I think you're really seeing more of an increase in mental health problems, because the way things work with fear is fear robs you of power, love, and a sound mind, 2 Timothy 1:7, right? And so when you give yourself over to a spirit of fear, you're allowing something you can't control to control you. And I just found that those who can learn to say, okay, I guess, Jay, I would say this way: the serenity prayer is powerful for right now. God grant me the serenity, which is peace, to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And I think when you learn to live in that space, you learn to regulate your own emotional self and mental self and find a way to live in peace. If you're not able to do that, then what we are seeing is an increase in depression. We're seeing an increase in anxiety problems. That is going to manifest itself in ways to medicate that pain. So we are seeing an increase in addictions, drug abuse, screen addictions for kids. New York Times just talked about. So we're actually seeing a lot of increase in some addictive behaviors, trying to deal with the loneliness, the isolation, and those kind of things.
Well, let's talk about marriage and COVID.
Uh-huh.
Obviously, couples are now spending significant more time with one another as travel has decreased, outside activities have decreased, the common distractions that we had pre-COVID. If couples say, okay, we want to use this time to really work and improve our marriage, what steps, what identifiers would indicate a marriage is healthy, thriving, and growing?
For me and my work, the best way to know if your marriage is thriving is you have a sense of us. Now, I live in a world and teach in a world that the most important part of marriage is not me, it's not my wife, it's us. When us wins, you both win. Us loses, you both lose. And I tell people, every decision you make in marriage gives to you or gives to us. Us is a higher way of living. It's living for the relation itself. And the way you know us is in the house is you feel it. You feel the warmth of connection. And I think it's giving couples a sense now, as it's gone on, to start to look at each other and sit down and start to talk again. We know that the way the brain bonds and attaches is by confiding. Confiding requires vulnerability. Vulnerability leads to intimacy. And when both couples sit down and start talking, sharing their hurts, sharing their fears, sharing their appreciations for each other, sharing what they're grateful for, sharing their wishes and hopes and dreams. All of that, they sit and listen, builds an intimacy. It builds a connection, you see. And I think as couples have been together, Institute for Family Studies did an article. Brad Wilcox, he's one of the leading researcher on the health of marriage nationally. He's out of the University of Virginia. He's been posting on Twitter here and some other places that some of the trends now is that some marriages are actually getting healthier and more connected, because the longer this has gone on, they're starting to communicate, they're starting to talk, they're thinking more in terms of us than self. And I think that's one of the first thing is you'll build a sense of us. Secondly, you'll start communicating to each other. You'll start sharing your hopes and dreams, those aspirations.
Yeah. This past Sunday, our pastor talked on racial reconciliation, and he provided a template for conversations that could take place between the different ethnic groups that would help facilitate reconciliation that might actually be helpful in marriage. He said, when you sit down, talk about your history, your hurts, your heroes, and your hopes.
Yeah.
And I just thought, that's a wonderful template for couples to use as they're trying to reconnect. So, as we see the vaccine rolling out a little slower than we want, but we see hope. So as healthy couples are coming through and we're getting to the other side, what do they need to keep in mind to really work on their marriage and make it healthy?
Now, let me say this. The way you build a relationship is not through agreement. Americans value right and wrong, agree or disagree. The West does. But relationships can be destroyed by agreement. One of the things that we are very strong on in our world and we teach, as a matter of fact, I'll be sharing this with the mentor couples, that the way you build a relationship is that you must be willing to listen to each other's perspectives. There's only one reality, but different perspectives of a reality. And what happens in relationships is, you know, I have a perspective of something, Luella, my wife, has a perspective, but our perspectives are different. And what we do is we argue over whose perspective is right, whose perspective is wrong. I want you to agree with mine. But what we don't recognize is this: both your perspectives are right based on your perspective. One reality, different perspectives. And so we say this way: you build a relationship, Jay, when two perspectives come together. So by putting perspectives together, you have understanding. Understanding creates relationships. But we don't want understanding. We want to win. We want it right. I want you to agree with me. And that will destroy a relationship. So, you know, one of the things that we always tell people, if you want to work on your marriage through anything, even COVID, start to listen to each other's perspectives and honor each other's perspectives and put those perspectives together. And that gives you a greater sense of what your reality is, because that creates understanding. And understanding creates the relationship. That's the best way in my mind to do racial reconciliation as well, is you have groups who are saying, well, I'm right, you're wrong. What if we put each other's perspectives together? We have understanding and find out you're both right and you're both wrong based on perspective. But now we can come together through understanding. And in that understanding, we can have conversation because there's a connection there. So I always tell people, don't fight for right or wrong.
Yeah. Well, let's think about the couples that were struggling or are struggling. You know,
Mhm.
they're even perhaps considering ending their marriage through a divorce proceedings. What can a couple do that has found COVID to be kind of the last straw in their relationship with each other?
The first thing I would say is to ask this question. And I always ask this question to couples in that state, because at that point, the brain feels more pain and I want out than pleasure. So I always ask this question: do you, to any degree, on any level, and I say it very strategically that way for the brain to handle the question, still love or desire your marriage and your partner? And if they go, well, yes, on some level I do, I say, great. On a scale of 1 to 100, how much you in the marriage, how much you out? And if they say, well, I'm 95% out, but I'm 5% in, then I go, great. Give me 100% of 5% for 3 days. Let's put it together. What happens is the brain, we honor the part of the brain that's wounded and hurting. We don't honor the little part of the brain that still wants something, that still desires something. I go, why don't we just honor the 5%? We already know it's over here. Let's honor that and help that part grow. So that in order to do that, you're going to have to move to humility. Once you move to humility, you're teachable. Once you're teachable, things become possible. You see, and so most couples don't know how to fix the marriage. They don't know what to do different. And this is why there's research that shows that couples in high distress do not do well in marriage therapy. They actually end up divorcing, and because they don't know what to do different. So if they don't know what to do different, then we need to teach them how to emotionally regulate, how to communicate, how to reconnect emotionally, and how to bond. And when they have those fundamental skills, they're then empowered to go create what God wants them to have, which is that abundant life and a healthy, strong usness marriage. And so I would say first to that couple, first and foremost is, do you on a level want the marriage? And if there's a yes on any level, go, good. Do you want to fight for that part of you? Yes. All right. Here's what we need to do then. We need to help you know what to do different. Here's some things you can do. Here's some programs you can learn. Get someone who can show you and mentor you or coach you, or even counsel you, but show you what to do different to create what you want. And this is the path that we use in our work, is we get people unstuck and moving forward. But humility is essential to that. Matter of fact, I live by 4 words, and I teach it as fundamental. If you want to have a great marriage and a great life, you must, in all areas of your life, operate from goodwill, respect, humility, and empathy. Now, Jesus was all of those. But if I can treat my wife with goodwill, and I'm respectful, and I always send the message that I care, that requires humility. Pride will undo the other 3. Matter of fact, humility, I say, is the fertilizer for all human virtues. All human virtues are fertilized in humility, but pride will kill off the human virtues. And so if we're going to live a life of virtue, what Jesus would call the abundant life, right?
Yeah.
Love, peace, those kind of things. Then we must move to humility and begin to hear each other's hurts, begin to hear each other's pains, hear each other's perspectives, and start caring and communicate with goodwill and be respectful in all aspects. You'll build an usness back rather quickly.
You know, during this time of COVID, we might have a little bit more time
Uh-huh.
on our hands.
Right?
Instead of watching TV, maybe we can look at other resources that might enhance and whether it's a good marriage trying to improve, an average marriage trying to improve, or a wounded marriage. What are some resources that you would recommend to couples for them to read or to pay attention to?
Well, unashamedly, that is my work. So we have what my program is called Relate Well, and I had great teachers and mentors. We actually teach couples what to do different. We actually teach skills for emotional regulation, and that's at relatewell.us. The other thing is there's some good books out there on how to build an intimate relationship. Dr. David Ferguson's work from the Intimate Life work, now called Great Commandment. His work, you can find him at greatcommandmentnetwork.com. Dr. Lori Gordon, though she was not a Christian, wrote a book, Passage to Intimacy. Her work is very biblically sound. Her husband was a rabbi. I worked for her and wrote a Christian version to her curriculum many years ago. Her work was profound, and she was a huge influence in my life and understanding how God designed us to bond and connect. There's another resource out there. There's a lot of really strong resources, but I would say to those couples that are struggling, learn what to do different. Find a skills-based curriculum so that you know how to operationalize the truths that you just learned. In other words, don't be hearers of the word only, but doers. And these programs actually teach you how to do the word. Like I say, I don't teach people, I don't tell people be angry and sin not. I show you how to be angry and sin not. And I don't say, well, speak the truth in love. I show you how to speak the truth in love. And so those are things I had to learn early on in my life as an adult so I can create the marriage that I wanted, that God intended for me. And so I would look for those kinds of platforms to learn. I also believe this strongly. Research shows that if couples start practicing gratitude, appreciations every day. Matter of fact, this is fascinating too, Jay. Research shows on the brain, when you move to a place of gratitude, your brain won't feel anger, it won't feel resentment, it won't feel bitterness. It only feels the gratitude. Is it any wonder why God tells us in everything give thanks?
How about that?
For everything give thanks. Because when we move to gratitude, we're not just focusing on what we don't have or what's going wrong. We're also able to focus on the positive things of life. We can be appreciative. Now, I live by this. I share appreciations all the time with people. My wife and I live this way. I did it with my kids and raised them to be appreciative and grateful. So begin to start sharing gratitudes and appreciations every day with each other. We can always find something to be grateful for.
Yeah. And just to let our Dogwood family know that through our ministry area, we now have what's called marriage mentors. And these are individuals that will come into your marriage, coach your marriage, support you in your attempts to grow and develop a healthy or healthier relationship with one another. And so if that is something that you're interested in, feel free to get in touch with me. And I would love to give you that information, how you connect to a marriage mentor. Now, Richard, let's transition and let's talk about children and parenting. I'm hearing from parents that the stress levels of balancing work, and in some cases, they're having to be the home teacher, making sure the kids are doing school online or making sure schoolwork's done. Enormous stress there. What would you suggest to parents as they navigate this new dynamic of teaching, of coaching their children during COVID?
One, if we understand stress is really it's a message that you just have to do something different. That's all stress is. Most of us get debilitated by stress, but stress is just telling you got to do something different. Don't keep doing the same thing. Shift, do something different, and you'll reduce the stress. So if we begin to see stress more as a sign, something needs to change. That's all it is. Now, if you're, we homeschool our kids, so we always joke around the homeschooling parents saying, "Oh, everybody's homeschooling now," right? Back when all this started, right? And so it was normal for folks like us, because we raised our kids that way. They're all adults now. But for the parent who is used to working, and where both parents worked, and now they're home all the time, they have to adjust. They've got to find some level of balance. And what's going to happen is they're going to focus on, well, am I doing my work right? Am I doing parenting right? Am I doing all these things right? And the one person they're neglecting is themselves. One thing that Jesus made it clear in his own personal life is you got to get away and be still. You need some alone time to get your head back together, to focus. Meditation, mindfulness, prayer, whatever you want to call it, they're all the same. They're all essentially the same. But give yourself some time. You tell your kids, hey, this 20 minutes is dad time. This 20 minutes is my time. Y'all go over there, do that. This is my time. Find time to get yourself centered, to just take a deep breath, and just put things in perspective. This will pass in time. You can handle this. You are not alone. God is with you, right? He's got church family around. Hopefully he's well that support you, but you can make it through this. And when you're feeling overwhelmed, take that deep breath and get yourself centered. What I call it out here in life and time.
Mm-hmm.
Get yourself centered in reality and just take that deep breath. Make sure you invest in you. All right. Then I can approach today from a source of strength, not a source of being overwhelmed. Because when we're overwhelmed, we're being ruled by stress and ruled by fear. And then we make some pretty poor behaviors. We snap at the kids, those kinds of things. Yeah. So always do good self-care.
Yeah. A moment ago, you alluded to the increase in screen time and some concerning statistics that are coming about children using screens. Could you elaborate a little bit more about
this
the research?
Actually, early last week, New York Times did an article on it, and there are some others who are noticing in some of the children's online platforms and games are noticing huge increases of children ages 9 to 12. One platform said ages 9 to 12 use their platform. It was like a 68% increase in screen time. And they're concerned about that because we now know through research, particularly research on the brain, that there is such a thing as screen addiction. And it's linked to dopamine. The areas of the brain that a screen lights up is the same area of the brain that cocaine lights up. All right. And so there is a real concern that when kids are home, that they're actually they're spending their time in front of a screen, be it iPad, a phone, video game, television. All right. It's a reward for them. It hits the reward centers of the brain. The problem is the more they hit that, the more the kid's brain is drawn to that and it becomes addictive over time. So one of the cautions is don't tell your kids they can't use it, but as parents, be responsible. Set time limits for them. Set boundaries for them. Because here's what we know. The longer a child is using a screen, 5 hours or more a day, the more agitated they'll be, the more aggressive they'll become, the more defensive they're going to be, because they're agitating. They're not actually developing the frontal lobe, the neocortex. It's all the lower brain, which is our emotion and fight and flight, the fight and freeze response. And so help them set boundaries for themselves. That's what we do as parents. So you can use it for this amount of time. After that, go outside and do something else.
Yeah.
No.
So when you and I were children, and we were irritating our parents, getting our parents' nerves, they just said, go out and play. Now, in my case, I lived in Texas, so it's go out and play with the rattlesnakes. Probably your case too, but now it seems like the parents are go and play on the tablet and go watch TV.
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting back thinking, because I did my radio show yesterday on this topic, and I said to my co-host, I said, I grew up in Sandy Springs and Powder Springs, Georgia. We would spend a lot of time outside. Back when we were kids, I'm 59. Parents didn't worry about what you were doing. Come in when the street lights come on, right?
Mhm.
They didn't worry about it. Nowadays, parents are worried about whether their kids are outside. And I think it's become a double-edged sword. We don't want our kids outside because we're afraid of what might happen. But at the same time, we're putting them in the house. So we're actually afraid for them to go out, but we want them to do something, but we don't want to go out because we're afraid of it. And then we put them in the house. What do they have to do inside?
Yeah.
You see, so if you want to keep them inside, get them board games, tell them to read, do other things, but limit the amount of screen time they actually go to. Because one psychologist called it bundling, and I didn't think about it until I read the article. It's not just the video games. They're using iPad, they're using computer for school. You see, they're actually using screens for so many different things today. Everything they're doing is in front of a screen, just like now. And I've never thought about it. He's absolutely right. His term was bundling, like the AT&T them do, you bundle products. But he says everything they're doing is in front of a screen. And we've got to limit that amount of screen time to help them develop their brains in a healthy way.
Richard, 30 minutes that you and I are talking is certainly not long enough to fully debrief family life in COVID, parenting life in COVID, and so forth. I suspect that people will want to connect to you, look at what you've done, connect to your podcast, and just reach out to you in general uh, for resource help. How can people get in touch with you? How can they connect to your resources?
Relatewell.us is our main website. Relatewell.us. If they want to learn more about me, there's a link there called Dr. Rick. Just link there and it gives a lot more details about who I am. The other parts are about our curriculum where we actually teach people healthy relationship skills and how to emotionally regulate. I raised my kids on the principles in the Relate Well process. So I've raised my kids that way and they're healthy, mature adults to this day. I would say do that. My email is rick@drrickmarks.com, drrickmarks.com. So they can find me that way as well.
Well, thank you for your time. And for those that are participating in this conference, a final word about the breakout sessions. In a moment, you're going to listen to Dr. Gregory Moffett as he talks about the impact of COVID on our mental health. And then you're going to be invited into various breakout sessions. So you'll have instructions as well later on by Angela Johnston. But just know that the breakout sessions are going to be live. They're going to start at 10:45. You should see a link on this page that will take you to those breakout sessions. So they will be live starting at 10:45. We look forward to working with you more, and thank you for participating in today's mental health conference. Have a great day.
All right, hi again. If you weren't present for the first round, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Dr. Greg Moffett. I am the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Point University and Professor of Counseling Psychology. And I am a licensed professional counselor. My specialty is I typically work with children who've experienced trauma. I've been in practice for about 35 years, and I'm also a certified professional counselor supervisor. So I've been in the mental health business for a long time. What I addressed in the first round was a little bit about what mental health is and how it affects us. What I'd like to do in this session is talk a little bit about how COVID has affected us as a population. I probably could make a list of things that have affected me, and your list would look very much the same. But as a mental health person, this is probably the most common question that I've gotten from the media and from clients in recent months is how is this impacting us and how do we manage it? So that's what I want to do here for the next few minutes. So if you can give me about 15, 20 minutes of your time, that's what I'll do. I write a newspaper column here in Fayette County, and in my Thanksgiving column, I wrote about something that I was thankful for. And if we were live, if we were together, I would ask the audience to guess what I was thankful for. Now, besides my family, I doubt you would ever guess, but the article was about the silicone microchip. Now, that might sound really boring to you, but hopefully you'll understand why here in just a minute. What I want this session to be is not only informational, but I want it to be encouraging. I'll tell you why the microchip here in just a second. I I live in Fayette County, like many of you do. I built my house in Brooks in 1994, and back then it was a long distance telephone call to Sonoya, which is only 10 miles away. So if any of you remember those old days with a landline, when you had to call long distance, you had to watch the clock to see how long you were talking. I got a cell phone, my very first cell phone back in those days, and for $60 a month, I got 10 minutes of talk time. Everything after that, I was charged by the minute. So it wasn't uncommon for people back in those days to have a cell phone bill for a single phone that was several $100s because you got charged every minute. You also got charged roaming charges, and you got charged for long distance back in those days. Back then, there were no smartphones. There weren't even any Blackberries. There was no Skype, no Zoom, no video conferencing, and the internet was still pretty new back in those days. My first modem for my computer was so slow that I would turn it on, I would go take a shower at the end of the day and let it load, and after about 15 minutes, it would load a web page. That's how slow it was. You couldn't watch streaming video. As recently as 2003, I was in India and I made a telephone call home. It was 15 minutes long. It cost me $80 to talk to my family. Today, I can talk as long as I want for free. I spend most of my summers in Chile, and using Skype or some similar format, I can talk to any place in the world as long as I want for nothing. We could go back further in time and talk about other technological changes that have happened. But why I'm telling you this is if this virus had happened 20 years ago, without what we know now of as the silicone microchip, we couldn't function. Now, the microchip's been around for a long time, but it's gotten smaller and smaller and allowed us to do things that we just couldn't do 10 or 15 years ago. Even the camera that I'm staring into, when I was first doing this kind of work back 20, 30 years ago, that camera was about 10 times as big and it weighed about 15 pounds. If you could see the camera now, you could probably put it in your pocket if you had a big coat on. So what encourages me, and I hope encourages you some, is that we have things pretty easy now. So as an educator, back in March, a year ago now, as you're watching this, I had to shift from being on campus in person to doing everything digitally, but I can. I can do my job from home. I can do my job using my cell phone. How great is that? So in a way, I've thought of this COVID virus as the great inconvenience. It's not been what I wanted, but if it had happened many years ago, it would have shut us down and probably crippled us. But as it is, it's been an interruption, and that perspective helps me deal with it a little bit better than maybe if I wasn't thinking that way. Regardless of that, we've all been affected by it without a doubt. I know people who've put their weddings off 2 or 3 times. They keep waiting, assuming things are going to get back to normal, and then they don't. I personally have lost 2 uncles in the last year, and neither of them could I go support in a funeral. So my aunt on one side of my family, her husband died almost a year ago now, and I've not even seen her because she is concerned about the virus, and we're all waiting to grieve together for a time when this virus is gone. Almost everybody has been interrupted that's a working person. So even if you still go to your job every day, your job certainly looks different. I know for me as an educator, it's changed almost everything that I do. I'm still doing my job, I'm just not doing it the way I used to do it. As a mental health person, I do telemental health, so using Skype or some HIPAA compliant format like that, but it wasn't my primary means of communicating back before this virus happened, but now it is. And that makes a challenge. So when I'm looking into a camera, especially when I'm working with children, that's a challenge. Many people have lost their jobs. Back around the fall of 2020, the data that the government put out said almost a third of all renters had failed to meet their rent. That's pretty challenging. I don't know how you feel about your kids being home. But if you didn't homeschool already, almost everybody was homeschooling at least some, and having the family together 24/7 certainly changed things, and it changed the dynamic of our homes, if nothing else. I don't know if this was a challenge for you, but limited resources at the store was a challenge for a while. Running out of toilet paper, running out of paper towels, that certainly was inconvenient to say the least. I'm at the age where I've thought about retiring. I try not to even look at my IRAs because I know the numbers are up and down now because of what this virus has done. And my mom told me something that I will share with you. These are her words. She says, "I find it frustrating that Walmart is full but churches are empty." That probably has been somewhat of a disruption for you as well. So none of us has been immune to what's going on. But one thing I want you to understand is that any stress magnifies existing stress. So what happened is whatever issues were going on in family dynamics or at work or individually, those issues were magnified by the stress that this ongoing virus has given us. So whether they're marriage problems, relational problems, addictions, whatever they may be, those things have all been exacerbated. My clients that I've been working with that have addiction issues have it's been crazy because the last thing they need is to be sitting at home with nothing to do all day long. People that have had already stressful marriages, those marriages have exhibited much more stress because kids are home all the time. You're seeing this person that you're frustrated with all the time. And some of the normal outlets you might have to decompress have been gone. So just know if you're experiencing that, you're normal and you're certainly not alone. So what I want to do for these next few minutes as we move toward conclusion is talk about what you can do to take care of yourself. The first thing you've got to do is monitor your own physical and psychological health. I know personally I hate change. I use the same deodorant that I started using 25 years ago. If it works, I don't change it. If I go to El Ranchero for lunch, I get a number 11, always. I get the same thing every time because I know that's what I like. So by not liking change, I know that in this past year, everything about my life for the most part has changed, and that creates big stress for me. So taking care of myself, I must recognize that that's a challenge for me that I have to face. If you're a person who doesn't mind change, then it's probably not been as big an issue for you. One thing that's worked to my advantage, I am an introvert. I don't need a lot of social contact. So the easy part for me has been the isolation that almost all of us have experienced because of this virus. But on the other hand, if you're an extrovert, that has probably been a major challenge for you. So recognizing who you are, what you need, and what your challenges are going to be a step in trying to take care of that and take care of yourself. Almost everything in mental health comes down in some way or another to grief. We grieve things that we lost. We grieve things that we wish were so. And whether you've had a loss of a job, whether you've had financial stress, whether you had lifestyle change, it's okay to recognize that this is a grieving process. I know it's not the same as losing a person, but its effect can be somewhat the same. And especially if you've had several of those things affect you or your family, a loss of job, financial stress, maybe having to move, you can expect that you're going to experience some grief-like symptoms. Managing that yourself, managing it with your family, managing it with the help of a counselor or your pastors is a starting point. I would encourage you to not stop your routines if you can avoid it. So if you shop on Fridays and the stores you shop are open on Fridays, continue to shop on Fridays. For somebody who's kind of ritualistic like me, I need some of that routine. The days I go to the office or the days that I shop, it makes me feel a little more normal when those things don't have to change. So if you don't have to stop your routines, don't. Now, one thing that I have to warn you about, I think probably most of the population is the point we want things to get back to normal, but I think we will never go back to normal. I think we have a new normal. one of my research projects I did quite a few years ago was on trauma survivors. I asked the question, what helps people survive trauma well? And I looked at a variety of types of trauma, but one of them was spinal injury victims. When people's lives are upended because of a spinal injury, everything that they know has changed. And one thing that I learned from that process was that somewhere around 2 months into treatment after an injury, spinal victims start recognizing something they call the new normal. They'll never go back to the way it was. They'll never be walking like they used to or riding bikes like they used to. But once they recognize that new normal, that was a point of healing where they began to see the world in a more realistic way. So what I suppose is going to happen for us is we have a new normal. I think some of my students will never want to go back to the classroom the way it used to be in a traditional system. I think some of the things that we've all taken for granted that if there was only one way to do, we've had to learn a new way of doing that we may actually like better. Some of you may have found that you like working from home, and maybe your jobs will allow you to continue to do that. So all I'm saying is, if you think things are going to go back to normal like they were before this virus, I think that's not going to happen. And when we recognize that the world is a different place because of this, it will help us cope with it a little bit better. If you're a parent, one of the questions that I've gotten quite a bit is, what do we tell our kids? And like any other challenging things, you have to consider the age of the child and developmentally what's appropriate for them to hear. But generally, regardless of age, an open dialogue with your kids is important. Are we all going to die? No, we're not all going to die. Is the virus going to go away quickly? Doesn't seem to. Are we okay? Yeah, we're okay. Keep that open dialogue. And answer the questions that your children ask you. If you don't address their questions, they'll feel like they can't ask, and then they'll be left to either wondering or talking to their friends, which may not be the best resource. Identifying specific stressors for you in isolation. As I said earlier, I'm an introvert, so being alone has been great for me. Hasn't affected my social life too much. But if you're an extrovert, finding new ways to socialize, to meet with people. It's not the most ideal circumstance, but digitally, because of the microchip, we can see people and talk to them and interact in large groups even in a digital format. Don't underestimate how frustrating it might be to see masks everywhere. I didn't realize how much that bothered me until several months into the virus. But it's not that I didn't like wearing a mask or I didn't want to see people with a mask, is that the mask was sort of an icon for sickness. And that ever-present icon can make us worry at a subconscious level that we really don't realize that we're doing. The same thing can be said about stores. Stores being closed or not having what you need or not having normal hours. The one thing I do enjoy doing socially is going out to dinner. I haven't eaten in a restaurant in months, and that disruption has frustrated me. So when you put all those small things together, just recognize those stressors can act as that magnifying glass that I mentioned a little while ago. There's something I call Moffat's mantra. If you're a student of mine, you've heard me say this: eat right, sleep right, and get plenty of exercise. The three critical components for good health. It's very easy if we sit at home all the time to nibble on potato chips and to not eat well, to change our sleep cycle and to not exercise. But regardless of any mental health disorder, those three things have to be addressed. So keep in your routine a focus on those issues. Finally, what I would suggest you do is do something called reframing. Reframing is looking at something in the positive as opposed to the negative, and that's why I started with the microchip. I haven't liked this disruption, but I think about how awful this could be if we didn't have the options that we do have available to us. I don't watch the news. I don't listen to how awful everything is. I don't listen to reports about how many incidents of the virus have been reported, because those things just make me feel bad. Now, I'm not hiding my head in the sand, and I'm not a Pollyanna, but what I am saying is there's positive that can come from where we are right now. And I think one of those positives will be innovation. So as an educator, let me tell you this, I've seen education change in the last year, and especially as the dean of my college, I've had to do some things I didn't think I would ever enjoy doing, but looking at the positive side of it, I can stay home and teach my class. I can have meetings without having to drive in traffic. Looking at that positive side has helped me manage my frustrations and stress. So the last thing I'd like to leave with you, I'm not your pastor and this isn't a sermon, but I would like to leave you with a spiritual encouragement. One of my favorite sections of the New Testament is in Philippians, and almost everybody knows Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. But I feel like it's imperative that we read the 2 prior verses every time we think of this. So let me read this to you and I'll conclude. The writer of Philippians says in chapter 4, verse 11, I am not saying this to you because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Then the writer says, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. So my encouragement for you is, even though this has impacted all of us, we can endure anything through Christ who gives us strength, because it isn't about our present situation. It is about something way bigger. So with that, I will leave you, and I thank you for your attention in these past 2 sessions.
Thank you for your participation. We are now preparing to send you to breakout sessions hosted on Zoom. Please select the breakout of your choosing from our Dogwood Church mental health page. As a reminder, here are the sessions. Where is God in a Post-COVID World? By Jay Vineyard and John Warnock, pastors at Dogwood Church. Post-Traumatic Growth, Moving Past Pain into Strength and Advancement by Cameron Butler-Wooten, LPC, LMFT Arise Counseling and Coaching. Helping Children and Teenagers Navigate a Continual COVID World by Margie Johnson, Administrator at Landmark Christian School. Dealing with Grief, Loss in the COVID-19 Pandemic by Ann Sharon, MA and LPC at Grow Counseling. And Addictions and COVID by Dr. Richard Marks.